Hey class, so we're finishing out the chapter on evolution this week, and this lecture video is on evidence for evolution. So I want to talk to you about 3 or 4 or 5 lines of evidence that we can see that are, some reasonable evidence that biological evolution has occurred. Right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the fossil record. So if you remember from last week, I mentioned to you, like pre-Darwinian, that there were primary ideas about species fixity. The idea that the organisms on the earth were fixed. The composition, the kinds of things there were on the planet had always been the same, will always be the same. None of that stuff is ever changing. And well, of course, the fossil record shows us that that isn't true, right? So the fossil record shows us both speciations, and another part of the second half of this chapter deals with the process of speciation. So there's a lecture video just on that process coming up. But it shows us this is a formation of new species, right? New things that are appearing. So of course, in our lifetime, we can't see that, right? Speciation takes a long time. We're not going to get it in 100 years or 200 years. It's millions of years. So, we can see that stuff happening in the fossil record, right? The rocks that are deeper are older. Rocks that are more on the surface are younger. And sometimes there are clear delineations of when you go from one rock layer to another, we see something, then all of a sudden we don't. Or we don't see it and all of a sudden we do. So that's showing us that there are speciations and extinctions. Right, so the basic generic idea with both of those things is that the species composition, remember that just means the kinds of things, like cumulative kinds of things we have on our planet. So the species composition does change. Right, so the fossil record provides pretty good evidence for that. And remember, evolution, we kind of described it as accumulating adaptive traits and passing those traits on to offspring. So, we can see those accumulations, and we see them with speciations and extinctions. Okay, and then also the fossil record provides really good evidence of lineages. So these would be evolutionary lineages. The idea of lineages we kind of see as if we have this ancestral population here, that's a population of one kind of thing, and some of them evolve this way to do something, say live in a grassland, some of them evolve to live in a tree, etc. And then these can branch out and do a couple of different things. So that's what we're talking about with a lineage. It's the idea of being able to connect that, if we just label these as A's and B's and C's and D's, being able to connect that A and D are ultimately part of the same lineage, or B and D, or B and C, or C and D, whatever, right? So the fossil record shows us a lot of these lineages. Now, one of the drawbacks, one of the things people always use as a kind of a counter argument that the fossil record doesn't show us anything is the fact that there are missing pieces, right? Like their lineages are not complete, and it's the missing link idea, right? So yeah, a lot of lineages aren't complete. We may not know every single thing in the transition from B going to C and B going to D, but there are some lineages that we do know. And this picture that's here is from our text. This is on horse evolution in North America. And it has a reasonable transition, right? If you look at the timing here, the times of these things, this is transition that shows us the horse lineage as it evolved in North America the last 55 million years. There's really good fossil representation of these things and the structural changes that occurred as we went from one of these to the next in the lineage, to the next in the lineage. And if you look at, our book doesn't have it, I don't think, but if you look at the true cumulative lineage of horse evolution, there's a lot of stuff that are dead ends, you know, like this makes it seem like it's this thing leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. Well, sort of, but it's more like this. And then here's this one thing that's today, right? So all these things would be extinct parts of this lineage that aren't around anymore. But we still have good fossil evidence of those things, and that lets us build this picture. All right, so that's a few things the fossil record does to provide some evidence for evolution. All right, the next thing is anatomy, and I'm going to go ahead and combine the anatomy with embryology. Okay, so this picture that we're looking at here, it has limbs in 4 kinds of animals: humans, dogs, birds, and whales. And it color codes bones, right? So the purple ones, that would be your fingers, your finger bones. Here's what it looks like in a dog. Here's what they look like in a bird. Here's what they look like in a whale. Okay, etc. The yellow ones, the wrist bones. Here's what they look like in the dog or the bird or the whale. All right, so this is anatomy stuff, right? It's what do these bones look like? How big are they? How small? How long? How short? How bulky? How whatever. Just kind of basic anatomy stuff. Hey, now the deal with these things is these bones that are here, they are referred to as homologous. They are homologous structures. And there was part of the pre-lecture assignment that had you look at homologous and analogous structures. And you may remember homologous structures, it's going to mean that they have the same origin. So as they're developing in these embryos, the human, the dog, the bird, the whale embryos, these bones come from the same set of cells, right? So what I'm telling you here is if we have one of these embryos, and they can do this, they can like radioactively label cells. And then this little patch of cells I drew in my embryo as orange, well, they become this orange bone in the whale, this orange bone in the bird, this one in the dog, this one in the human, right? So they can follow that. Literally, there are scientists that follow that by using radioactivity and trying to figure out if this is the cells in the embryo, where do they end up in the adult and what do they look like? So all of these embryos is kind of where the embryo part of this number 2 comes in. This embryo could be good for any of these organisms. Now, of course, like a whale embryo is going to be bigger than a bird embryo. Yes, there's going to be some size differential stuff going on. But structurally, like if you just compensated for the idea of one smaller, one's bigger than the other, if you're looking at this group of orange cells and the embryo, it's all going to look the same, right? Literally, if you take an embryo that's at week 4 of development, you're not going to be able to tell, is it human? Is it a dog? Is it a bat? Is it a bird? Is it a whale? Is it a cat? What is it? They pretty much all look the same, right? So same origin, but we're going to have different functions. Right? So that bone in the arm of a human, I mean, multiple kinds of functions, right? Lifting stuff, turning stuff, holding yourself up, whatever, right? Like it's a lot of different kinds of functions. But then if you look at it in the dog, well, it's definitely supporting weight there and definitely used for moving and doing things like walking, running, jumping, right? We don't use the bone in our arm. We don't use it for that, right? We don't use your arms for walking or jumping or running. And then you go to the orange bone in the bird. Well, it's used for flying, right? So that's like zero weight support. So the musculature associated with that bone is going to be for flying. And then for the well, that's swimming, right? So we have these bones that come from the same places in whatever embryo we're looking at, but they end up having a little bit different anatomy and different functions. Hey, and here's the thing with this. This is really the bottom line with this anatomy embryology section. Let's pretend like we take the dog example and the well example. Let's pretend like you have never ever seen a dog or a well before in your entire life. And then I showed you a picture of a dog and a picture of a well. No one, you might say you would, but I guarantee you, no one, if those were the first times you were seeing those two animals, you would not think they were related, right? These are all mammals except a bird. The bird's not a mammal, but humans, dogs, whales, those are all mammals. We're all related, right? But there's no way you would think that by looking at those animals. So this anatomy with these homologous structures and the embryology that goes along with it, it shows us relatedness, right? It shows us some of that lineage and evolutionary relationship stuff. All right, number 3 is biogeography. Biogeography. So I'm going to show you one book thing and then my own thing with this. So this shows you distribution of a plant. All right, so of course here's the plant. Don't care about what the plant is. I don't know why that didn't write. Don't care about the plant, but there's some little picture with the plant structure. Okay, so this plant develops on one of these areas here. So maybe here, I put the blue star. But at this time, all these continents are coalesced. They're all kind of one big mass. So if that plant originated here, at this particular time, it could spread, right? Using seeds and stuff like that, it could kind of spread everywhere. Okay, well, these continents break up over time, right? So here's current day. Continents are all broken up, but we still find this particular plant, or it's fossil. This could be a fossil as well. We still find it everywhere the red is colored in. Right? So it's kind of like if you looked at this plant and you say, well, this plant is in Central America and South America and Africa and Madagascar and parts of Asia and Australia. It's like, how could it get to all those places? Like, how is this plant? Plants aren't mobile, right? So how would this plant be able to get to all those places? And the answer is the idea that these continents were once one big mass, and that's how this is spreading. It's the geography of biology, right? That's kind of what we're looking at. And then I want to show you my version of this. It's a little bit different. So if we have a couple of continents, it doesn't matter what the continents are. We're just going to call them A and B. If we have a couple of continents and we get these things that evolve on these continents, right? So here's some organism that's evolving, and on each continent, we're going to have diversification. So this population leads to a big lineage that leads to all these other different things. Well, let's say one of these things looks like this. All right, so we pull those out. We have this, we have this. Well, up here, I was telling you, you look at the dog and you look at the well for the very first time. You're not going to think those things are related, or at least not very much related to each other. Well, if you come back down here and you look at these two things, well, they look the same. So they've got to be related, right? Like literally, they must be from the same exact lineage, but they aren't, right? Because the ancestor, maybe I should have made these different colors here, but the ancestor of this green one is this, and the ancestor of this purple one is this. So these, the green and the purple aren't even very related, or maybe not related at all to each other, even though they look practically the same. Okay, so what it tells us, the biogeography idea, is it tells us that it doesn't matter what these things look like out here, that this would still be more related to this than these two things are, right? Even though this down here that we're saying has this relation, that thing may look like this, right? So it may not look anything like our green circle. It may look completely different. And it looks like they're not related, but in fact they are, because they come from this common ancestor here. So the geography, the distribution of these things can tell us a lot about evolutionary lineages. All right, one last thing for this list, molecular biology. Okay, so molecular biology, we're looking at things like amino acid sequences and DNA sequences, which we have talked some about in our biotech chapter. We talked about DNA sequencing. Right, so we can look at those sequences, and the more similar the sequences, if we have sequences of these things that are more similar, that means that these things are more closely related. More similar the sequence, the more close the relationship is going to be. So you may have seen some examples like this, like, you know, evolutionarily speaking, the closest living relative to humans are chimpanzees. Okay, and I want to clear up real quick using this example, like that is not saying humans evolved from chimpanzees. That's wrong. Remember the idea that we have an ancestral population. Some evolve like this, some evolve like this. Chimpanzees, humans, common ancestor down here, right? That's what we're talking about. But since chimpanzees and humans came from the same ancestor, they're very closely related species. And you can look at things like there are certain genes and certain proteins that have amino acid sequences that are like 98% the same between chimpanzees and humans. That's a lot of conservation, right? That's a lot of, if this much of the DNA is the same, then these two things haven't deviated very much. Now, are we different? Of course, right? Chimpanzees and humans are different. And this is only some of the genes that we look at. It's not literally all 100% of the DNA. But we can use molecular biology to show relationship and relatedness. And when I was in graduate school, there was this brand new technique coming out. It was called DNA hybridization, and they were using it, just starting to use it for classification. And I remember that a lot of people were doing it with birds. And I remember, like, you would look at birds and go, well, that looks like a hawk or something like that. And that's traditionally what it was classified with and grouped with. But then they do all this DNA stuff and go, oh, you know what? That's not really closely related to a hawk. It's closely related to a pigeon or something like that. So they use molecular biology a lot to kind of make sure we have these relationships correct. All right, so those are things we're doing for evidence for evolution.